We've been doing this story about Jacob, and as you read with me in the 37th chapter of Genesis, we're continuing with that story, and I'm only going to give you 3 more messages from this story because I'm hoping to wrap it up before we get to Thanksgiving. Hopefully at that point we'll begin to see it all coming together and how God works in this man's family. The family is totally dysfunctional in many ways. There's a lot of evil, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of deceit, there's a lot of not caring. And all of it, and the family becomes what it becomes because of individual choices of individual people under the leadership of Jacob, who really doesn't know how to be a very good father to his family. I am always kind of in awe of people that have 12, 13 children. How do you manage all of those kids? But Jacob, I don't think, is a good example for us. But what is a good example is the fact that God is able to work in a family like his and change it for good. Change it so that people come together and they begin to trust God. It's all about our relationship with God individually in a family. And when each member of the family comes together with the Lord himself in a good way, many other things that are wrong with the family tend to get better. No, I'm not saying they all get completely better. There's work to be done. There's apologies to be made. There's changes in behavior that need to come and things like that. But God is able to do that if we will trust in him and lean upon him. I read to you verses 1 through 11 of chapter 37. I want to read the rest of the chapter to you now. You remember that Jacob rebukes Joseph for his dream. But at the same time, there's this nagging remembrance that there was a prophecy concerning him himself that was about his brother, the older one, bowing down to him. And so he's wondering, what does this all mean? Continuing with the story, verse 12. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. Do you remember Shechem? Remember that Shechem was not a place of a real happy part of this family. That was when John was preaching, and John told you the story of the rape of Dinah. That was the city there in which all of that occurred. So maybe you can imagine that there might be some concern in his heart if they are going to that place again, because you remember they didn't leave on good terms. And they were afraid that they would be attacked by a gathering together of Canaanite families and cities because of what Simeon and Levi did there. Well, he says, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Well, very well, he replied. That's Joseph replying. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. And then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are, or where they're grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. And so Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in a distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. And then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. And now the cistern was empty, and there was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, well, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" And then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. And they took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning I will go down to the grave to my son." And so his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Wow, what a story. What a story. Whatever possessed them? None of us would ever think of doing such a thing, would we? I mean, I hope not. Kill your own brother and do it as a conspiracy, all of them wanting to see him dead. What in the world brought this to the front? There have been some changes going on. There have been some things developing, things that were really tearing at the very heart of this family. You know from the stories, the messages that I've been sharing with you, that these boys, these 12 brothers, had been brought up in a family in which the mothers were at each other's throat continually, trying to compete with each other for the attention of Jacob. And Rebekah had an advantage in that she was beautiful and he loved her. But Leah had a different kind of a weapon. She had fertility and she could have children, and she had 6 sons. And after the last one, she said, "Surely I will be honored now." Because, you see, they wanted Jacob's attention. But Jacob only had eyes for Rachel. And as a result of that, the boys were watching this going on continually. And they learned this behavior of distrust, of tricking one another, about lying and deceiving one another. And then we begin last week in chapter 34 to see some of the results of that. We see them tricking the Shechemites, deceiving them into thinking that they really wanted to become part of them. And they told them that they had to become circumcised, and when they were in pain, they went and slaughtered them all. Where did that come from? Where did this anger, this pent-up anger and frustration and brutality come from? But it was in the family, probably from Laban and his responses to his son-in-law, and perhaps even as they observed Esau coming with 400 men and thinking about, here it is, this is what families do. They get brutal at times and they fight each other. Maybe people will die in the process. And so this family had become this way. Another change going on here is that Jacob has lost control of his family. He did not want them to do this murdering of people in Shechem. But he was kind of like disconnected, not involved. He's an absentee father for many of his children. It seems that he only had eyes for his wife Rachel, and yet he reneged on his responsibilities to raise these other children well. They sensed it. They knew he didn't really care that much. I mean, if Dinah was able to go off and go visit the people in the neighborhood, you understand, I'm sure John probably told you this, that in this particular culture, at this particular time, this is probably the most dangerous thing for her to do, is to leave the family unaccompanied, without some sort of guard with her, because the people that surrounded them did not share the values. Well, not that their values were all that great, but they understood that you didn't violate a woman, you married her. So why is it that Jacob permitted her to go? Why isn't he even involved enough to know that she went? And then when she is raped, why is it that he doesn't say anything until his sons come home? And they're the ones that do all the negotiating. Why isn't he leading like he ought to? We also see that he's lost control of his sons when he rebukes them. And their response is not, oh, you're right, Dad, we should never have done that. It wasn't that way at all. They said, well, should they have abused her like a prostitute? It's a defiant answer. It is like, no respect. We see an ultimate of disrespect in chapter 35. This is coming up to our chapter 37. In chapter 35, the oldest son, Reuben, who is the one who is entitled to the birthright of the family, begins to see things coming apart for him. He sees, first of all, that Rachel dies, and that Benjamin is born. And Rachel names this baby son of my sorrows, and Jacob changes the name to son of my right hand. And this preoccupation with Rachel isn't appearing to disappear even when she dies. And now there are two sons here who are actually going to be a competition to him. He goes in and sleeps with Bilhah. A lot of people from our generation and our culture look at that as, well, that's a little perverted. Here he is sleeping with his stepmother. But it wasn't simply a sexual thing. Perhaps it wasn't a sexual thing at all. Maybe it was simply a power play. The same kind of power play that Absalom carried out against his father David. Remember when Absalom came and attacked Jerusalem? He was advised by his advisor to take the concubines of David and sleep with them in the sight of all Israel, therefore staking his claim as being the king. Perhaps this is what Reuben was doing. But Reuben is the kind of son, though he has aspirations, doesn't have the resolve to carry them through. It doesn't appear that it really took, in a sense, that he succeeded in what he attempted to do. We see this weakness coming out again and again, even in the story that we read here today, where his brothers don't respect him and they don't obey what he says that they ought to do. And so Jacob is seeing his control loosening, and pretty soon, he's thinking that things are really out of control. There's a storm on the waters, and there is trouble in his family. There are the serious losses that are making things even worse. The loss of Rebekah's nurse, and Rachel dying, having her last child, and then Isaac dies. Death in the family changes a lot of things. It brings a lot of grief and a lot of sorrow. The rebellious sons are no help. And now we see that rebellion surfacing again. Even though Jacob's not aware of it, at this point it is surfacing again with Joseph. Maybe Jacob should have done something different over the years. Maybe he should have loved all of his children and his wives like he should have. You know, the Bible tells us that as he came to know God, it was his responsibility to tell his kids about God. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, we read in verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commands I give to you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on your doorframes of your houses and on your gates." Now, the law was not in existence in the time of Jacob. That didn't come till later when Moses was on the scene. But surely Jacob is coming to know this God whom he has a covenant with. You remember that he met him at Bethel and that God said to him he was going to be with him, protect him, provide for him, and bring him home. And he said, if that is true, then you will be my God. And then he gave promises to him that he would worship him. But he didn't pass this on to his children. They were not also worshipers of this God. Well, granted, at the beginning of Jacob's experience in Laban's territory, he was still learning a lot about God. But he could even at that point talk about the things that God had revealed to him so far. And he could have in prayer and through his own experiences say, you know what, God has been in protecting me. God has prospered me like he said. But those don't seem to have been communicated. So there's something that we might want to take away from this. The things that God gives to us, many times we store them up within our minds. And we talk about them when we come to church or when we're with other Christians. But I wonder how much of that we speak about to our children or to our relatives or to our friends. God doesn't give us these things, this knowledge of him and the changes he's made in us, in order that we might keep those things to ourselves. He tells us to bring up our children in the training and the instruction of the Lord. Maybe things would have been different for Jacob had he done this. But when Joseph comes along, Joseph, as you remember, was born in his old age. I get that. I get the fact that, first of all, Jacob is not the same person that he was when he had his other children. Joseph came much later. Jacob had changed a lot in his life. He had wrestled with God. And God had dealt with him about his own self-sufficiency. And God had dealt with him about faith. And I understand this because I think about my own children. You know, we had Laura 11 years after we had Nina. All those first three kids did not have the same parents that Laura had because we were different after we had learned a lot of things about God and about living in this world. And this is the same way it was with Joseph and with Jacob. Joseph had a different father. And there was this opportunity, in fact, a necessity almost, for Joseph to really connect with his father because he was the son of the favorite wife. He was the son that perhaps Jacob was always waiting for. And the one that became his favorite, not only because he came in his old age, but because he was the son of his favorite wife. And then when his favorite wife, Rachel, dies, he now becomes the remaining image. He sees her face in Joseph's face. And then perhaps it becomes such that he's always wanting Joseph to be around. It's hard for him to let him go and go out and do things out in the fields because He doesn't want to lose him like he lost her. And so there is this blossoming relationship, and Joseph reciprocates. Obviously, as we see him going throughout the rest of the story, that he has become a person who really is sensitive to God in his life. He believes that God is indeed sovereign and working. And so he is responsive to these things, and he listens to Jacob as Jacob speaks about them. And they become really kind of close. It's no wonder he's a favorite to his father. Joseph is not the same as his brothers, as we have just said. He is one who has integrity. He is one who believes in God and wants to do what is the right thing. But then there comes this catalyst. There has been this building of resentment amongst the other brothers, not Benjamin. Benjamin's too young to know about these things. But the other brothers' resentment over the father's attention to this Joseph is beginning to smolder. And they are beginning to respond to Jacob with less respect. They're arguing with him and not obeying him. And it's obvious that, well, as it says, they were beginning to hate this. And then comes the catalyst, that which sets things ablaze. And that is that Jacob gives him what we've come to know from the King James as a coat of many colors. We read here today that it was a coat that was well ornamented. In the Hebrew, it speaks about a coat that reaches to the wrists and to the ankles. What does that have to do with anything? It reaches to the wrists and to the ankles. Well, anybody who's going to be out working in the fields has no need for sleeves. Anybody who's going to be working in the fields has no need for a tunic that reaches to the ground. It becomes a problem. And so what we see here is that Jacob has given to his son favor in this, giving him the responsibility, the administrative kinds of responsibilities. Go see how your brothers are doing. He is training him to be the leader of the family. It's become evident that since Reuben has sacrificed his own right to be the firstborn, that Jacob has chosen the firstborn of his favorite wife. And this one is Joseph, and he will be the firstborn of the family. Wow. Talk about anger. Talk about resentment. Here comes this, they've been dreading the day when Rachel would have a child. They knew that she would rub it in their mother's faces. And now he's made him the rightful heir. He is the firstborn. We read this in 1 Chronicles chapter 5. It says, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, he was the firstborn, but when he defiled his father's marriage bed, his rights as firstborn were given to the sons of Joseph, son of Israel. This is what they perceived, and they hated him. Didn't help that God intervened and gave him a few dreams. But let's think about this for a moment. Going back to chapter 35, do you remember after that debacle with Dinah and the Shechemites, that God said to them, come, go back to Bethel, set up an altar, and I will meet with you there. Here they had behaved so badly, and yet God was calling them back to himself. Do you remember what happened the last time that God met with Jacob at Bethel? It was at the point when Jacob was running away from his brother Esau. And God was at the top of that vision, the stairs with the angels going up and down. And God spoke to him about being his God, and about he would be with him, and that he would protect him, provide for him, and bring him home. Now he's bringing him back to that very same place. And you wonder why? I think there's an important thing going on here. First of all, he's calling them back to a rededication to, I am your God. Now you need to turn. You see how bad things can get when you don't listen to me and obey me. Now come back to me. And Jacob responds with, okay, get rid of all your idols, get rid of all the earrings that refer to the idols and things like that. And let's change our clothes and let's go up to Bethel and we'll worship this God. But we see something else repeating itself here, and that is that God is going to tell him the promise one more time and say to him, I'm going to be with you and I'm going to prosper you. And this is the same thing being in preparation for another long, difficult time in his life. The first long, difficult time was with Laban and all of that 20 years. The next difficult time is going to be the loss of Joseph and another 20-year period before Joseph is found out to be alive when everybody thinks that he's dead. God is saying, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be with you. God intervenes at these places so that people can look back and say, God saw this coming. He knew that this was going to happen, and he was preparing me for this. And then these dreams that he gives to Joseph are a continuation, an extension of that. And these dreams speak about the fact that Joseph's brothers will bow down to him. The older will serve the younger. Same theme as Jacob had when he was first born. The point being that God is saying to them, there is going to be a good resolution of all of this. It's not going to be what you think it is, but I'm in control. You need to trust me. You have the sheaves of wheat bowing down to the sheaf of wheat. It seems to be indicating the kind of way in which he would be lording over them as he provides grain for them when they come down to Egypt and they bow before him there. The second dream is something a little bit greater, and that is that he says the sun and the moon and 11 stars bow down to me. It doesn't say that they bow down to the 12th star. They bow down to me. This is something in the heavens. The first dream was about things on earth. The second thing is about things going on above, which are greater in scale than the things that are going on below. And I believe that this is a reference to the fact that Joseph is a type. He is a person who points forward by image to Jesus Christ. And so the dream is speaking about Israel bowing down to Jesus. Now, if you really look at the story of Joseph, you're going to see Jesus in it over and over again. No, there's no mention of Jesus. But you'll see things that are going to show you that there's so many parallels between Joseph and Jesus. You'll read, for instance, that he was hated because of these prophecies. You remember that when he's coming to his brothers, they see him coming, they say, we're going to kill him and put him in a cistern. Why? Because we'll see what happens to those dreams. You see, they don't like the dreams because they believe them. They believe them. That's why it's upsetting to them. If they thought them as mere fantasies, the guy's dreaming again. He's losing it. But they know that these dreams are from God. And they don't like the direction that they're going in. So this is in a way in which they are expressing their rebellion against God himself. Well, Jesus was also hated for the prophecies that were given concerning him. You remember that he also was sought to be killed when he came into the world as a baby. And you'll remember that he also was rescued by being taken down into Egypt, just as Joseph was. You'll notice there's a parallel also between Jesus' death then together with what's going on with Joseph. The brothers resented Joseph, because of his righteousness, because he was always doing what his dad wanted him to do. He brought back bad reports. I don't know if they knew about these reports, but they knew that he was always saying, this is what Dad said. This is what we ought to be doing. And they hated him for this. And they also resented his authority and his designation as the firstborn. That is the same thing that people hated about Jesus. His life irked them because he made them feel bad about their sins by his righteousness. And then they hated him for the fact that he said that he had authority from God. And the people saw an opportunity to stop the will of God. And so they stripped Jesus of his clothes, as the brothers had stripped Joseph. And they insult him to his face, as we know that the brothers did to Joseph. And they send him to his death by the means of other men, as did the brothers of Joseph, not realizing in either instance that the sending of him to his death would actually result in the giving to them of his life. You see, God had planted within the family one who would follow, one who would obey, one who agreed with the prophecies and said in his heart, I don't understand how that's going to happen, but this is what he said, and I believe it. I believe also that on the days when he was in Potiphar's house and in the prison, these things were an encouragement to him that this is not the end. And then when he gets back to the place where he is in charge in Egypt, and we'll get to that story, he begins to put it all together. That the people, the brothers, meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. The dreams tell them at this point early in his life that God is doing something. And if they would not fight against it, but cooperate with it, how things would have turned much better. How does this fit into the whole family idea with us? Many of us come from families where there are lots of problems. There are lots of conflict. There is lots of abuse. There are memories of things that we can't even go back to thinking about. How is God going to work in a situation like that? It's different, I think, in different families. But I think our response to those things is the same as it was with Joseph. Are we willing to be God's instrument in bringing about the recovery of our families? We see from this story that it takes much time. It didn't happen just like that. But are we willing? Now, we may not know what it will cost us. We can see from the prophecies that someday things will turn out well if we follow him and do well. But we don't know what lies in between, what suffering there may be involved in this. We don't know how all things will work out, but we do know what God is calling us to do in being a Joseph. And that is to be willing to allow him to be God and to trust him with his plan and to do obediently the things by our character that he is developing so that he might use us as instruments and tools to accomplish his will in our families. I cannot tell you how things will go. I cannot tell you how long it will take. But I can tell you that God would be honored by your obedience, and you will find great satisfaction in being used by him, even though it may be hard, as you see him begin then to work in other people's lives, in your families. Let's pray together and ask God that he might give us courage for these things. Heavenly Father, you have a plan for each one of us, and you're working out that plan. I pray, Father, that you would help us to submit to that joyfully. Not that it would all bring joy to our hearts, but we know that you are God Almighty, you are right, and you're righteous, and you are good, and you love us deeply. We can trust you. So I pray that you would enable us to look to you for your leading in our lives as we try to respond to the families that you've placed us in, to love them, serve them, and be your instrument of grace in their lives too. Thank you, Father. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.